We're back live with you tonight, and thanks for staying on. The Department of Communications and Digital Technologies says the ANC-led government is ready to launch the much-talked-about State Bank. Minister Khumbudzo says Postbank is ready to take up the role of a state bank. She said plans to renovate the group's infrastructure are underway, while the banking license application is in the process. Minister Ntshavheni joins us now to give us more on this. Minister, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time.
Good evening to you and to your viewers, Thabo, and thank you for having me.
Minister, why would you want to take an asset that has been owned by a state entity that is currently bankrupt, for lack of a better word, and think that you can take it and put it elsewhere and it will do better there? I mean, clearly if the bank was to do better, it should be doing better for the post office itself.
Okay, maybe let's clarify that point first, Thabo. The Postbank and Post Office were separated already in 2015. And in terms of that separation, the Postbank has been an entity on its own. And on its own, the Postbank has not been is not bankrupt. It's financially viable. The Post Office, on the other end, has challenges. And for the period where you do not see the problems of the Post Office is because the Postbank has been standing instead for the Post Office. Unfortunately, because the Post Office does not have a full banking license, and for it to acquire a banking license, it needed to be then separated from the Post Office. But the rule says, or the law says, you cannot be owned by a state-owned entity that is not financially liquid, and that's why we're transferring the ownership of the Postbank to government to make sure that then the Postbank can then have full licensing, what we call the corporatization of the Postbank.
So who's going to own it now?
It's going to be owned by government, with the Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies being the shareholder representative.
Yeah, it's all very confusing, Minister. One would say it is still owned by that department, even as we speak right now. Of course, you being a shareholder in the Post Office. But you will create now a holding company. Who's going to be in that holding company? Because a holding company, my understanding, will be a controlling entity that is not necessarily going to be running the day-to-day operations of this bank.
It's called a bank controlling company, and the bank controlling company is done because you accept that a Minister of Communications will be clueless about the liquidity of banks. So when they need cash adjustments and so forth, you need the controlling company to make those funds available. But also, the controlling company then keeps what we call the reserve funds of the bank. In case they run low of cash, then the controlling company will then release that cash. Imagine if I have to release the cash, I'll still have to go to the Minister of Finance, and by the time I get the approvals, it's going to take forever. So that's why the bank controlling company comes into place to take those decisions that the shareholder, whose government, cannot take immediately, but also to make sure that they have full compliance with the banking regulations. Because unfortunately, or fortunately, the Reserve Bank controls how the banks are run. And if you're going to have a minister fully responsible for those decisions, the minister will not know the compliance with the Reserve Bank. By the time she understands, or the advisors understand, it's going to be too late. But the bank controlling company is then constituted by persons who know who are fully compliant, who understand the banking system, and who then can be responsive and respond in time. And the minister then becomes a shareholder representative and take the decisions that shareholders take in terms of the strategy of the bank and also those kinds of things. But the day-to-day operations and execution will certainly be run independent from government.
So who are the creditors going to pursue legally?
They're going to pursue the bank. The bank is a legal entity, and the bank will have its own assets that are independent of government as it's now, and they have a right to appear in court and to be sued and to sue for whatever loss or whatever gain.
So you have a bank and a shareholder who's going to say, hey, don't come to me legally when things go wrong. You have a holding, controlling company that is also not going to be held liable. And you're going to say, hey, the bank, you're on your own. If you mess up, you must deal with the creditors by yourself. But this is a decision that is coming from your office.
No, the bank controlling company it gets held liable like the bank. Even the shareholder ultimately. I don't know. I have shares in funny companies. I have shares somewhere, but they don't come for me as a shareholder. They come for the company as a legal entity. But when push comes to shove, where every other thing is done and there's nothing else, they'll come to me as a shareholder to say, this company that you have shares in, whether it's 5% of shares or 10% of shares, it's always giving us, and it cannot fulfill its own own obligations after we have even auctioned off its assets, and therefore you need to pay back and you need to step in, and that's what happens, and that's what's going to happen even in this regard.
All right, let's talk then about what you've already mentioned now, the question around how this entity is going to be funded. Funding costs, of course, are a major issue when it comes to banks, especially, for example, the kind of securities that you will need to put in place that the Reserve Bank is going to be looking at. So how are you going to fund this bank?
So there are two ways. The bank already is liquid. The bank already holds the SASSA accounts because they are the distributor of SASSA grants as from the 1st of October. We are engaging with other agencies of government that distributes funds so that the bank can also take over. And we have an in-principle decision with the National Treasury that all agencies that distribute funds, those funds must then go into the Postbank. But also the bank is going to be a state bank, so the government accounts are going to be held at the Postbank, and that means it allows them to then be able to raise money in the markets. It makes them liquid. We don't have to do a cash injection for the Postbank as of now. We have to look at their own modalities and say what improvements they need to do in terms of the contract that they service already, and what do they need to improve to make sure that they need additional cash. As the Minister of Finance has indicated, there is no additional funding that's going to be available to seed a state bank. We think within the relevant available infrastructure and resources, the Postbank can be able to fund itself and fund its operations.
Yeah. Some have raised issues around non-performing loans. We'll come to that now, but let's just talk about what you're saying. You're saying this bank is going to hopefully loan the disadvantaged people that have not been privileged enough to be financed and capitalized by commercial banks at rates that are non-market related rates, so to speak. In other words, cheaper, right? How are you actually going to do that?
Of course, they'll have to look at the modalities. It doesn't make cheaper rates does not necessarily mean they are non-competitive, non-market related. It makes them affordable. You can make it affordable by the the repayment period terms. Instead of repaying in 5 years, you can make a repayment of 10 years. But also the credit guarantee scheme, because we believe firmly that the government must reintroduce the credit guarantee scheme that they had made an offer to commercial banks for, because majority of the SMMEs have not recovered, or businesses in general have not recovered from the impact of COVID-19. And we are advocating strongly, was supported by the minister, in fact supporting the Minister of Small Business Development, that credit guarantee scheme must come back, and with the Postbank fully licensed, fully corporatized, and as a state bank, it can then do what the commercial banks do not want to do. And it can, because the commercial banks have always regarded our people as a high risk profile, and therefore, and with the Postbank, we don't expect that their risk profiling of our people will then be so severe that it excludes majority. As I indicated during the time when I was the Minister of Small Business Development, the banks only funded 25% of the people, and the 75% were not funded, irrespective of the fact that government stood guarantor of the repayments should the individual SMMEs fail to repay their debts.
Yeah. So what's the plan then? Because other analysts have commented to say, well, government doesn't have, for example, a simple way of collecting revenue for people who use electricity and water. How are they going to collect money for loans? What are they going to do with non-performing loans?
But who said it's government? It's a bank, and this bank is not going to be constituted by Khumbudzo or whoever else. It will be constituted by bankers who have been doing the work, who have been training the work. There's a way that banks collect their loans that are due. Why do you say this bank will not be able to collect the loans that is due? And this bank is regulated by the Prudential Authority, like all the other banks, and it will have to do what the other banks do to collect what is due to them. Of course, we are saying the terms must be more favorable to support our people.
And you're saying that the interest earned would fund transformation exactly how?
Interest earned from the bank.
Yes.
No, we're saying that if we're going to use the Postbank, like we're going to use the Postbank as a state bank, the money that comes in, it allows the Postbank to generate money on its own to loan from I don't know whether they get money, they loan money from the Reserve Bank or wherever the banks loan money from when they run out of cash, and be able to repay that, because there will be money that comes from the fiscus, not from the fiscus, from the government accounts, interest that will be earned there. And they'll have to look at their own modalities. If it means they must fund 1,000 people instead of 10,000 in the first year, let that be. But we are going to have the Postbank as an intervention bank, and also to do and to address market failures where the market has failed our people, because we cannot continue to have an untransformed South Africa, not because South Africans are not entrepreneurial, but because the financial services are not accessible to majority of the poor who are entrepreneurial in rural and township areas.
Right, let's take a break. We continue a moment. Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies, Mr. Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, and we'll understand a little bit more how this bank is going to work and how it will, of course, operate in the space of transformation. Do stay with us. Welcome back, and thanks for staying on with us. The Communications and Digital Technologies Minister, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, is still with us today. The state ready now to launch a state bank that will be a bank that will be offering cost-effective financial services for the appropriate target audience, saying it will operate like a normal bank, will be able to recover on its loans like a normal bank would certainly do, even though some critics have been saying, well, this bank is certainly not going to be sustainable. Let's talk about some of those politics, Minister, where some analysis is saying you are merely simply exploiting the sentiment of radical economic transformation to say, oh, well, the people, the ANC promised you a state bank, there it is, without actually doing the calculations.
I think it's very shallow to think that way, because the radical economic transformation sentiment started to emerge after the 54th National Conference of the ANC, and that's the VAR that took over the country. But the resolution of the State Bank goes back to the 52nd Conference of the ANC. And you know, we've had challenges in terms of implementing the resolutions of the governing party as the government, and we are improving on it. And we've looked at the time period that it took us from the 52nd conference when that resolution was taken to date, and we've looked at and done an analysis of whether the state bank is still relevant, and we found that it's still relevant. And the COVID-19 period has demonstrated that without fail. And also the global economic challenges that continue to constrain SMMEs in this country has proven that. But also access of our people to financing has not changed even between that time, even to date at an individual level. And for us, it's relevant. So we're not politicking. We're making an intervention as government to address the market failures, to make sure that our people can be included. Because if we do not include South Africans financially and economically, there's going to be severe consequences for this country. It cannot be that the majority still remains excluded economically, and the minority are the ones that control the means of production in this country. The majority must be equal participants in the ownership of the economy of this country.
So would you say part of the delays in the 52nd conference making the resolution, and you only coming now in the 55th conference saying now we are really going to do it, part of it is the fact that there were some also within the organization who held particular positions, including finance ministers, who were saying, well, there's no money to start this bank. It's just not financially viable to start a bank of this nature.
It actually that's not correct. The delay has been with the corporatization of the Postbank, and remember it took longer to get the first act that made the Postbank an independent entity of the post office, and the rules kept on changing as the Reserve Bank learned lessons from the collapse of the previous the banks that later made Capitec. I can't remember the names of those. The collapse of the African Bank. The rules kept on changing, and when the rules change, we have to change. For instance, the corporatization of the Postbank would have been possible in 2019 already, when the Postbank was made an independent entity of the Postbank. But then the Banking Act came into place and said the SOE that is not financially viable cannot then become a owner of a bank. And that's why we had to do this amendment and introduce the bank controlling company. So that's the rule. But the issue around the board of the Postbank and the competent authorities of the Postbank have always been there. They've always tried to then appoint people into the board, but there was also a requirement, remember, that the post office must include 2 of its members into the board of the Postbank. And in terms of the rules and of the Reserve Bank, that will not allow them to then become competent and what you call fit and proper people, because the entity that they represent is not a financially liquid entity. And those are the changes that came through. It's not like there was not attempts or there was no work done. There was work done, but the rules kept on changing. And what we have then learned and done this period around is that when the rules change, we've moved quickly to make the necessary adjustments so that we're then fully compliant.
Yeah. But it was last year, Minister. It was just last year, I remember very well, where the South African Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, said the following, saying that the country lacked the money that is needed to back it. And so saying they ruled out the idea of a creation of a new state bank. What has changed?
No, so because the problem is that we go for headlines or snippets of quotes without the full context. That comment relates to a comment when he was talking about the African bank possibly becoming the state bank, because the African bank, 50% of the African bank is owned by the Reserve Bank and 50% is owned by the commercial bank. But for the African bank to then become a state bank, government needed to have almost more than 10 billion to buy out the shareholding of the commercial banks, and that's the money that government did not have. And they were thinking that it would take us longer to clean up the Postbank structures, and it has been quicker and smoother since we took over to move into to clean up, to conclude the public participation on our part, and to go to Parliament and to get the Parliament to conclude its public participation processes. And it's only just waiting the tabling in the House. Those were just delays, but that comment relates to the African Bank being acquired, or a portion of the African Bank being acquired to make the African Bank being a state bank. And maybe the follow-up question you're going to ask me was the possibility of later the Postbank taking over the rest of the ownership of the commercial banks in African Bank and merging the banks. And I'm saying that will depend on what the board of the Postbank at that time, when they are fully a corporatized bank, and the assessment of the African Bank or the African Bank assessment, what they will find viable, and therefore decide to take a business decision if that is viable.
All right. What does this then therefore mean around the payment of social grants? Will the Postbank continue to be paying social grants as a state bank?
Yes, the payment, that's the key issue. The payment of the social grants will continue be done by the state bank. We are strengthening the security feature of the SASSA cards. We are going to replace the current SASSA cards because they do not have the necessary security features to stop the theft or the siphoning of money by the syndicate of criminals. And they are going to continue to do that. But it's not only paying that. We are looking at how do they use the banking infrastructure and the banking system to allow the beneficiaries of SASSA grant to build a credit profile of their own that they can use for either individual loans, or they can use for business loaning, so that we can also clean or drain the social welfare net of the country, so that we don't have people who are continuously dependent on social welfare, whereas they could, with their own resources and access to funding, they could then become viable business people. And I was saying to somebody earlier that because we are an integrated government, the Postbank, when it funds SMMEs and individuals who want to open their businesses, they'll have access to your enterprise development agencies that are owned by government. So we can give a full suite of support, not just only a loan, extending a loan to an individual for business or to SMME for business, but put enterprise development, put business marketing in there, because government has those agencies, and say this is the package that we give you to give a chance for your business to succeed, so that we can then walk back and say this business has succeeded because they were funded by the Postbank and they've repaid the Postbank. They were supported on their enterprise development by CEDA, for example, or any other enterprise development agency, and their businesses were marketed by Proudly South Africa, and so that their brands can be sold out there in the markets.
Yeah. Here's another comment that seems to have rubbed people up the wrong way. Maybe you must just clear it in what it actually means, that government employees will be paid through this state bank. What do you mean by that suggestion?
I never made that comment.
Yeah, there's a comment that seems to suggest that somebody during the conference of the ANC said, well, then state employees would need to be taking their salaries or getting their salaries through this bank.
So, you know, the tagline of the Postbank, and I wanted to wear the cap, but it was because I'm not in studio. The visuals were not good for the camera. And so we're saying Postbank your bank. So we're going to make the Postbank your bank of choice. So government employees will decide to go and bank with the Postbank. But what we know for sure is that the bank accounts of government will have to move to the Postbank. But the individual accounts of government employees it can be anywhere else, but they'll be paid from the Postbank to the account, to the bank account where they hold the bank account for now.
All right. The final one is maybe also political and maybe ideological also in a sense. One analysis is saying, well, I mean, how are you going to be giving loans to these disadvantaged communities who do not have collateral, right? How is that going to work? These people don't own land. The first thing that you're supposed to have done is at least give them land so they can put that as collateral when they go to this bank, if indeed this bank is going to follow the normal processes of banking in how they determine who they're going to lend money to.
I think, like you've said, it's very political, but it makes few assumptions that are incorrect. Government has been transferring land ownership to the people where they deserve. In the townships, we've been giving land. In communal areas, we've been recognizing permission to occupy as land ownership. So those type of things that are not recognized by commercial banks are recognized by the banks, and we have been moving to make sure that those assets in the townships and rural areas that people sit with that have not been recognized by your standard financial services are recognized. And we have done that, Thabo, you know my track record when I was in CEDA and CIFA, where we're funded on the basis of collateral of communal land ownership, and we've recollected CIFA during my time, we're able to collect the loans due to them at the right time from the people that were said are high risk, and we were able to collect the loans.
So how is this going to be handled? The hiring, the firing of managers, you know, that is referring to cadre deployment. Number two, how are you going to monitor the performance of this bank?
Okay, let's start with the last one, monitoring the performance of the bank. The bank will have its targets like any other entity, like any shareholder would say, this is the returns I want to see, this is the target market I want to service, you need to remain viable, and so forth and so forth. Over and above those targets of the shareholder, there's the Prudential Authority, which is the part of the Reserve Bank, who also have requirements of performance targets of banks, and they'll put those targets of banks, and the bank will have to meet those targets. I don't know whether it's annually or quarterly from the Prudential Authority, but they'll have to satisfy that. That's one. Secondly, in terms of the hiring, the board is hired by the minister, it's appointed by the minister in consultation with cabinet. But for the board to be appointed in terms of the act, not only the Postbank Act, but the Banking Act, they need to be approved. The individual designated executives, they'll need to be approved by the Auditor General. They do what we call fit and proper assessment. From there, by the Reserve Bank, who also conduct what we call a fit and proper assessment. So if I want to deploy Thabo as a board member of the Postbank, it's not only my decision as a minister at the time, it also has to be assessed by the Auditor General on the fit and proper assessment. And then when they've passed that, they get recommended, they go to the Postbank, to the Reserve Bank, the Prudential Authority who will do the assessment. If Thabo does not pass the fit and proper assessment, Thabo will not be appointed because it's a requirement of the law. And that requirement extends also to the executives. The executives are not hired by the minister, they're hired by the board, who go through a search process. And again, the executives are subjected to the fit and proper assessment of the Prudential Authority. And if they're not fit and proper, they will not be hired. It's like any other bank. The bank will be fully regulated by the Reserve Bank, like all the other banks, and they will have to comply to those requirements. We'll all have to comply to those requirements, but it doesn't take away the mandate of the bank of closing the market gap and the market failure that has not been addressed for over almost 30 years now by the commercial banks since the dawn of democracy.
Mr. Ntshavheni, as always, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on and availing yourself tonight for In Focus.
Thank you for having me.